everybody. We should get started. I want to welcome everybody. Welcome to the Haynes Walton Jr. Lecture, which honors the legacy and the many contributions to research and to his department and our own center that Haynes made. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. It's a great honor for us here at CPS to host this event and to host our distinguished speaker. I welcome you and I welcome our speaker, Diane Pinderhughes, on behalf of all the CPS faculty and staff. To those of us here who knew him or knew his work, and especially worked with him or were mentored by him, you know, as I do, that Haynes was a very special person. I knew Haynes from the first day I came to the university in 1993, and I feel very fortunate. I'm going to brag that I was even a co-author with him. More on that later. He was an acute observer of human behavior, and it showed in his demeanor and in his research. He laughed easily, and he was always friendly. As a scholar, he was guided by the search for deeper truths about American society. And if you knew him and were around him, you also know that he had the messiest office in CPS and was very proud of it. For those who didn't know Haynes personally, you see his legacy all around you in the strength of our programming and the faculty and the students in the study of race, ethnicity, and politics. He was instrumental in making our center and our department a top place to study the important issues in this area of research. So one day in the 1990s, in the midst of one of the budget crises during Bill Clinton's presidency, Haynes came into my office with a copy of a letter he had found in the Ford Library Archives here at Michigan. Haynes was giddy. It was a letter that a young Bill Clinton, 28 years old, had written to President Gerald Ford in 1974, recommending policies to obtain a balanced federal budget. I'll let you ponder the historical ironies of this letter's existence. From a young, idealistic, liberal Rhodes Scholar running for Congress for the first time, to a moderate Republican president in the mid-1970s commenting about the evils of budget deficits. And then Clinton's later presidency, where he was the last president we've had, a Democrat, mind you, who balanced the U.S. federal budget. Haynes and I wrote an op-ed about it, in fact, and I still have the op-ed on my computer. It never got accepted. I think we aimed high for the Times or the Post or something, and I'll take the blame for the fact that it wasn't accepted. It certainly doesn't fall on Haynes. But my experience with Haynes was, among other things, exciting, fun, and poignant in retrospect, watching him experience the joy of discovering a small nugget in an archive about Bill Clinton, someone Haynes ended up writing much about, and someone Haynes, too, found ironic and complicated as a person and as a president. We're very grateful for the many ways that Haynes was a part of our center, and we're grateful to all those who support his legacy, including those who have contributed to the Haynes Walton Jr. Fund. Plug, Haynes Walton Jr. Fund. I'm now going to turn the lectern over to Vince, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll make my comments relatively brief. I'd like to begin the process of hearing what Diane has to say. I know Haynes will be happy to have Diane here. They were obviously good friends. And I mentioned jokingly to Diane as I was getting ready to prepare my remarks this afternoon that I looked at her CV and it was like 50 some odd pages long. So it was hard to find all the various accomplishments that she's put together over her illustrious career. Let me just highlight a few of those, however. She is a former president of the American Political Science Association. Indeed, she's the first black woman to hold that position. She's also a former president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, author of 4 books, numerous articles and book chapters, and she has personally recruited a number of prominent undergraduates into our profession, most notably the late Mark Sawyer, who was one of her undergraduates, Lori Fraser Yoakley, Dorian Warren, who we tried to recruit here to Michigan. He went on to Yale instead. And our own Zoe Walker, who has just started our program. So she's got a long list of accomplishments. We're very happy to have her here, and I'm looking forward to her comments. Please join me in introducing or to welcoming our speaker, Diane Penry.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you, Ken. It's an honor to be here, obviously, and this is, I'm not very good at this, the Haynes Walton Junior Lecture for 2019. I'm so honored to have been invited to deliver the lecture. I especially appreciate the University of Michigan and the Center for Political Studies' decision to make this lecture series in Haynes' honor a reality. Haynes was a colleague of long standing. He worked with many colleagues, co-authors, and friends, and was engaged with the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. It was a very good day when the University of Michigan invited Haynes Walton to join your faculty. It was an especially sad day when he left us. But it's especially powerful that Haynes' colleagues with whom he worked recognized him with this lecture series, with the endowment, and I thank you, and I'm moved by the invitation to speak. So undertaking this lecture is an honor, but it's also a challenge. And we know what an endless array of work Professor Walton contributed through his own work and with and through his students. I'm not great at this. So. Introduction. Some of this you've seen in the abstract for it, but the lecture explores the factors shaping electoral and policy developments in the wake of 20th century civil rights reform and the growing political incorporation of African Americans into electoral politics. Drawing from a set of collected papers that are being compiled for publication as Black Politics After the Civil Rights Revolution, social and political scientists have recognized the gradual increase in African American political participation, the increasing number of elected officials of color, and perhaps most remarkably for many of us, the elections in 2008 and 2012 of Barack Obama to the presidency. That was a kind of mountaintop moment, I think, that we all felt. Many have said they didn't expect that to occur. The unexpected election, therefore, afterwards of Donald Trump in 2016 posed a direct challenge to that framing of reaching the mountaintop and the evolution of successful racial reform. So the lecture explores the possible alternative explanations for the Obama and Trump presidencies in sequence. No, I don't fully explain them, but I talk about them, and whether these changes in early 21st century politics will reflect those the patterns in previous eras. So the categories I'm using for these for the talk today is first of all, the development and evolution of 20th century U.S. racial politics, Black politics after the Civil Rights Revolution, that is what happened after civil rights reform was enacted. Talk a little bit about the 2018 midterm elections and racial dynamics around them, and the unexpected politics, Obama and Trump, and explanations, and what's next after Trump. So I use this set of 4 themes or elements for explaining the development and evolution of 20th century U.S. racial politics. In other words, if you put these together, it provides you with a big framework. One element, collective action; a second, innovation and improvisation; a third, institution building; and the fourth, the strategic use of the federal system. And the first 2 are here, collective action and innovation and improvisation. And on your on your left is collective action. And by this I mean that collective action among African Americans evolved as a result of some of the ways in which politics was shaped in the early 20th century, or the beginning of the 20th century. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court in 1896, affirming the legality of de jure segregation; lynching, which became a routine part of life, particularly in the South, from the late 1880s, 1890s through the middle of the 20th century. The resurgence of the Klan, which meant that both Klan resurgence and lynching meant that public officials and the police and criminal justice didn't feel it necessary to put any constraints on that kind of activity. Post-World War I, there was, a century ago, there was major racial violence in many cities. There was lynching in the South, the Klan, but in cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Tulsa, Oklahoma, there were major riots. Tulsa was the location of what is called Black Wall Street. And substantial portions of the black community was ransacked, was bombed. People were killed. We don't know how many at this point, and the city is still working at trying to explore and has recently begun to explore how many people were killed. There's reports that there were cemeteries where the population was literally dumped, the black population. John O. Franklin, a historian's father, was a lawyer in the town at the time and left to try to adjudicate some issues. His family didn't see him for months afterwards. So the second one, so the idea is collective action. These kinds of activities created an environment in which the African American community felt the need to represent itself, to provide some kind of political protection as a group, that without that effort at developing political alliances, racial alliances, religious alliances, it wouldn't be possible to survive. The second element is innovation and improvisation, and this is a photo of a 21st century, but it's intended to suggest the extent to which black organizations, black groups founded new bodies that would represent interests within a larger set of circumstances. So NCOPS, the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, founded in 1969 after a walkout by African Americans from the American Political Science Association. There was a meeting in Los Angeles in 1969. I was a child in elementary school. No, actually, I was just graduating from college at the time, but I wasn't already a member of NCOPS. But people like Jewel Prestige, Mac Jones, and other leaders decided something happened, and I have to admit, I don't know what it was that prompted them to walk out, but they were dissatisfied with what the association had done, and so they walked out of the meetings, and people like Jewel Prestige helped create the circumstances that created NCOPS as a different organization of political scientists. Sometimes some of the other academic associations created separate ones, but they might meet at the same time as the national body. The sociologists, for example, have a sequence of meetings. They meet around the same time. NCOPS meets at a different time of year, separate location, separate time. There's not a kind of an affiliation at all. So this meeting is 2007, and since I'm in it, I have to mention the other people. Casey Morrison, Desiree Pettisclo, Pearl Robinson, myself, with my eyes closed as usual in tail photos, Michael Mitchell, Lisa Aubrey, Julia Jordan Zachary, and Ife Williams. These are people who we're the older generation, and then these are the younger sets. So the idea is, when we look at black organizational history, there's many examples of this kind of innovation and improvisation. You'll find black associations in every place you look. I was noticing a former University of Illinois librarian who's now works in the medical library at the University of Southern California. There's an association of black medical librarians that meet evidently on a regular basis. One of the ones I didn't know, there's black FBI officers. There are many types of these kinds of organizations. And NCOPS is one that got founded in the middle 20th century, but there were many others earlier in the century. So, for example, as you know, the NAACP and the Urban League founded 110 years ago. in the wake of riots in Atlanta, Springfield, Massachusetts, Springfield, Illinois, for example, and needed to represent the interests of African Americans. Some decades later, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was created about 1939, 1940, and there have been there's several generations of these types of legal defense fund, and they've continued to evolve. The Mexican American Legal Defense Fund in 1968, Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, Asian American. Some of these names have changed. The now Legal Defense Fund, National Organization for Women also. So building those institutions, of course, the NAACP's association, or LDF, led 20 years later to the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. They spent 20 years working at how to bring about desegregation in a variety of areas in American life. The last point, the strategic use of the federal system, of the entire federal system, comes directly from Lucius Barker's APSA presidential address in 1993. The African American experience strongly reinforces the long-held observation that the limits and capacity of particular political strategies and institutions are determined essentially by their interaction with and interdependence upon one another. Especially for minorities, however, the choice of strategy must be taken in larger context toward the view of making more enduring changes in the rule of the game, the process, and the system. Electoral strategies resulting in electing mayors and controlling city councils, for example, mean little unless they work towards bringing about such enduring changes. And I would argue enduring changes throughout the federal system. It almost, there's no area that you don't have to work in terms of African American politics. And as we've seen in recent, not so much decades, but over the last decade, where areas we thought that were relatively stable, or where you could assume a kind of routine treatment of African Americans, have suddenly or gradually become more problematized with the interactions with the police. Never great, but have become increasingly problematic and troubled with the ongoing killings, first in the street, then the interactions in cars, more recently people in their own homes doing nothing, finding themselves subject to police. I don't know what to call it. Misconduct is a word, but obviously taking someone's life when they're sitting at home is not just misconduct. So my goal is to talk about these environments over a very broad range, to talk about the dynamics of political eras and the political dynamics of eras. And as these eras change, as the dynamics change, African Americans have pushed to enter, to change, to reframe their status. And each of the components, collective action, innovation and improvisation, institution building, and strategic use of the federal system, each of them has to be revisited, reconceptualized, and adapted as newly racialized frameworks are created. And part of the point, the main point there is that there is newly racialized frameworks as the eras change. You know, that you might think you're stable, and then things move along slightly differently, and you've got to reconceptualize it and redo it all over again. So you're talking about the colonial era, the American republics, the post-Civil War, de jure segregation, the Civil Rights era, post-Civil Rights, late 20th century, and now the Trump, post-Trump era. And I didn't put in the Obama, but I should have. What happens in each one of these spaces, in each one of these political environments? So for my collected writings, this is work that I've done over a period of decades. Previously published writing that I decided I would put into a single volume. It's not all of the publications, but it's some of them. I got the idea from that great political scientist Adolph Reed, who did this a number of times, and I thought, oh, this will be easy to do, just put them together. and publish them. And that seemed good, and I'm always slow about things, and so I didn't quite finish at a point when I might have, like the end of the 20th century or the very early years of the 20th. So then at some point, you can see Obama's going to get elected, and he does, and then I still don't get it done, and then Trump gets elected. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to have to write a different kind of conclusion to this. What's the explanation for this new environment? But these are the categories: political power and participation, civil society, interest groups and political parties, national institutions, domestic and international policy, black politics in the age of Obama, and then the kind of what's next. And I don't really, most of these publications, they have implications across these boundaries. They're not all neatly situated in them, but they're the ones that I've chosen to place each of the articles that I've selected. I decided I have to do some symbolic representation. So this is from the National Archives, the actual signed Voting Rights Act by Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. Then some symbolic photos of events, with the first one being one of the marches in which you see Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King. I don't know which march this was, but it was an important one. You see, I don't know if anyone knows this political scientist, Ralph Bunche. And I hadn't thought about this before, but both Ralph Bunche and Martin Luther King won Nobel Prizes. Bunche for his mediation in Israel in the late 1940s, and of course King for his work in the Civil Rights Movement. And then this latter is lining up to vote. And notice it's done collectively. People are happy to do it. One of the things that's striking about this, for me, about the photo, is you had to march in order to be able to vote. You had to state publicly that this is something that needed to be done. You had to convey to public officials that it was important to do so in order to get the legal support through the Voting Rights Act, through the work of that liberal Southern politician, Lyndon Baines Johnson, which is, you always get interesting reactions from your students about, well, really, was he that liberal? Is he really good? I would be very willing, and I am usually very willing to say, he wasn't the world's greatest, but he understood how to manage the Congress, and he understood how important this was for the country, and so he's willing to push through and to do it. So these are each one of those categories in which there's some pieces, and I just am summarizing what I'm talking about in each one of these categories, and I'll move on to what the change is. So political power and participation, I talk about how we're voting, electoral participation, and strategic aspects addressed after the '64 Civil Rights Act and the passage of the '65 Voting Rights Act. Elections of black mayors. The Reagan and Bush presidencies between 1980 to 88 and 88 to 92. There's always been a lot of positive things said about President Reagan. Morning in America. This was not Morning in America for African Americans. It was a change that was distinctive, that pushed back against the civil rights reforms of previous decades. Also, the increase in Latinx and Asian immigrants, the work that we began to see from this institution, the University of Michigan National Black Election Studies, which provided us with, for the first time, detailed understandings of black elected participation in political attitudes. The next, civil society, interest groups, and political parties, in which I talk about African American civil society as reflected in electoral, judicial, and legislative politics. The work on Jesse Jackson's campaign for the Democratic nomination in '84 and '88, which obviously the surveys helped, but there was a tremendous amount of research done in those decades and those years by African American political scientists trying to understand what was happening. Both the surveys here, the Joe McCormick's work in 1991 for the Million Man March, the coverage by Lucius Barker, again, of A Delegate's Diary. He'd spent a year following Jesse Jackson around and writing about it. Then one of the things that was very problematic, the Justice Thurgood Marshall's resignation, which precipitated the 1992 conflict, and the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings, chaired by then Senator Joe Biden, and the voting rights renewal in 2007, which actually was renewed in 2006. It was due to be renewed in 2007, but the George W. Bush wanted it supported, and so he pushed it earlier than was required. National institutions. Again, the Reagan presidency marked an important change in racial politics and policy. Not a good change. In the Congress, there was simultaneously growing resources with the founding of the Congressional Black Caucus in 1971. The 1975, 82, and 92 voting rights extensions expanded the size of the CBC. Now there are other caucuses as well, such as the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, which operate collaboratively as a tri-caucus. The Supreme Court Hill-Thomas conflict was precipitated by strategic error on the part of the civil rights groups in debate over descriptive and substantive representation. So you can see how some of the topics overlap and lie between the two categories, but I think it's important to talk about each one of them. Domestic and international policy included the challenges African Americans faced on the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Commission on Civil Rights, which was the first entity that collected information on voting, numbers of African Americans in particular places, voter registration, political participation, obviously begun in 1957. Before that, there had been no data. There had been no information about how that worked. And I've included this photo of the late Theodore Hesburgh, because he was chair of the commission for many years, and then in recent years this photo of Hesburgh and King at a 1966 rally in Chicago was discovered. So domestic policy, the Civil Rights Commission, I had a chance to write about the role of the military in the Persian Gulf War because of the rather dramatic numbers of African Americans who were serving as in the military, who were not drafted but were serving in ways that required them to serve when called up by on the case of the Persian Gulf. People who were in middle-level administrative positions in schools and other kinds of organizations that meant that they were more likely to be subject to vulnerable to injury and death. These are some of the best and the brightest in the African American community, but yet they were serving in the Persian Gulf War. I wanted to write about that and did. Then black politics in the age of Obama, a big leap from the late 20th century to the 21st. The Obama questions, that was an article or paper I wrote for a meeting in 2008, where we were coming up on a point where you could see that it was likely that Obama was going to get elected. Several people who were very skeptical, had been skeptical about Obama's election, and we were all at the point, I think the economic crisis had begun. Senator McCain had begun to act out of control, as in he didn't know what to do, and everybody thought, oh, this is not good for the president. And we began to realize that Obama probably was going to be able to win the election. He was showing signs of calm and leadership at a point when others weren't able to do it. The Hope at Last for America was a small piece I wrote for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies as Obama was getting ready to assume the presidency. And I knew that there'd be a lot of expectations on the part of African Americans that certain types of leaders, that he should be able to transform the black population. He should be able to generate changes in income. He should be able to make all sorts of changes that he wasn't going to be able to do by himself. He would need political and electoral support. He'd need to have demands really coming from the African American community. It wasn't something you could simply command in the public policy arena, but that people would expect him to do that. I was right, unfortunately, because it meant they were kind of waiting for him to act in ways that weren't going to happen. And then I was invited to do a plenary for the International Political Science meetings in Santiago, just talking about what things seem to have happened 6 months into his administration. So then, what came next? The rise of Trump in the 2015-2016 period I've used this photo for a while, and I realize how painful it is to look at this set of people who were expecting so much from Trump and who were, you can see, somewhat disadvantaged in some ways already, in need of change. And there, I have no words for that, so I didn't put any words on the slide, but there it is. Let's take that into account. So then we come to the midterm elections and racial dynamics. And the Civil Rights Commission is required to do a report every year or so on the status of voting. And they talk about made a couple of comments. This is from that 2018 report. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act, black voter registration increased significantly in the covered jurisdictions. With strong bipartisan support, Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 5 times, each time under a different Republican president. Since the Supreme Court definitely avoided a direct attack on Section 5 by ruling that the formula in Section 4 was unconstitutional, the decision removed the mechanism for carrying out Section 5 preclearance without a direct attack on Section 5, but in effect invalidating, making Section 5 unable to be used. Now, what would need to happen is for this Congress to reauthorize Section 4, which is the section that specifies what the voting pattern is, what kind of discrimination there is, what the level would be that you'd need to have in order for voting rights to be found to be implemented in specific geographic areas. But there was an understanding that the current, this was in 2013 that the decision was passed, that Congress was not, a Republican Congress was not going to be willing to do that. So the court acted in a way that indirectly attacked Section 5 by invalidating Section 4. The Shelby County decision, Shelby County, Alabama decision, since Shelby County jurisdictions have made changes to their voting procedures that would not have received the federal government's approval. For example, some jurisdictions, including both formerly covered and non-Section 5 covered jurisdiction, have required strict forms of voter ID, purge voter rolls, reduce polling locations, documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, and cut early voting, among other contested voting changes that, on the specific facts in those states, operate to denigrate minority voting access in ways that would have violated preclearance requirements if they were still in effect. So the 65 Voting Rights Act, in place for many decades, and it's not that it's not in place, but aspects of it can't be implemented, and it makes it impossible for those same states that had been covered by the Voting Rights Act to be continued to be monitored by the Department of Justice, and for barriers to voting to be put in place. And you know, after the Obama election or after the Trump election, the Department of Justice wasn't going to be very aggressive about that in any case. But the court made it unworkable. So there's some data here on the, from the same report, looking at formally covered with non-covered jurisdictions and what kind of requirements or what kind of changes were in place. So national total in all states of activities, the voter ID requirements, there were 21, documentary proof of citizen 5, purges of voters from the polls 7, cuts to early voting 8, moving or eliminating polling locations 15, and for a total of 56. Most of these are, the majority in all of the categories are in the formally covered states, with 52%, for example, from voter ID requirements being in 15 formally covered states, only 47.6% in 35 not formally covered states. All right, so I wanted to show that. So, reflections on what's next, prospective futures. Looking backward, the 19th through the 20th century, a black historian, Rayford Logan, talked about this period as being the nadir of black politics. When after the Civil War, after abolition, African Americans had begun to exercise some power. They'd been able to register to vote. They'd been able to elect numbers of blacks to office at the local level, at the national level. But with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, with the overall understanding that the national government would not be aggressive about implementing and ordering and protecting the rights of African Americans, voter registration collapsed. Not that people weren't registered, but southern states worked very hard to undermine the ability of African Americans to register and vote and participate in public policy. And throughout much of the 20th century, black elected officials, but particularly academics, have looked back with horror to the post-Reconstruction period beginning with the Plessy decision as the nadir of African Americans that we didn't have to live through any longer. You know, it was like we're identified in the privileged times. We're in the better times. This was in the past. So looking forward, the question that this transition from Obama to Trump has raised is a kind of, are we looking at a 20th to 21st century new nadir? The dismaying prospect of another long period of exclusion, because if you think about it, the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision is not kind of overturned until the Brown decision in 54, but also the passage of legislation in 57, 64, 65. It took a long time, almost 70 years, to begin to move out of that period of racial subordination, de jure segregation. So the prospect of another long period of exclusion raises the question of what now and what next. My own work around these issues of democracy, political participation, and efforts to integrate on a stable basis and to begin to address the economic and political dimensions of citizenship was challenged by how you might frame it. What is it that we're facing? And one of the things I've really been struggling with over this concluding work on the book. But most of the work was conceptualized within a relatively stable set of policy values and expectations. And this becomes a colon. And the expectation was that racial and ethnic exclusion was no longer possible or acceptable. Naive, perhaps, optimistic, perhaps, But the Trump election, the appearance of the extreme representation of white nationalism, the Tea Party developments, the way in which the Trump administration began to make changes in policy, and then the president of the administration himself has expressed in increasing terms over the last 2 years, 3 years, his own willingness to affirm racial and racist statements. So what do we have ahead of us? Is it a new nadir? I'm going to propose a different prospect, a contested nadir, and I am co-author with Christine Sierra, Carol Hardy-Fanta, and Paige Lynn of a book on contested transformation, looking at Black elected officials, Black, Latino, Asian, Native American men and women, elected officials, the title of which is Contested Transformation. So, okay, I acknowledge the debt I have to that book. But I think it's also important to think about in this term as a historically developing prospect, past, present, and future. So I'm saying in this, when I look at these, I'm pointing here, I need to point there, looking at these examples of why I think it's contested but not a definitive nadir that we're facing. So when we look at electoral representation, you have the Civil Rights Commission's 2018 report. Changes, but at the same time, they're constraints, but they're not comparable to the early 20th century. In states like Louisiana, for example, I think the shift in numbers of people registered to vote went from several thousand, let's say 30,000, it went down to maybe 600 or 6,000. Very dramatic, extraordinarily dramatic drops and efforts at keeping blacks out of the voting box. When you look at substantive representation, there's been a substantial growth in elected officials of color at the local level and particularly at the national level. I'll give you some numbers for Congress in a moment. Economic reform is probably most problematic here, but I'm going to push it too. There have been modest improvements in income and wealth for a small portion of the black population. Academics, people in business, business leaders, social organization, social policy leaders. Professor Bowen, it's good to see you. So there's been some economic reform. It's by no means where it should be. The issue of wealth remains a very substantial policy issue, and we've been hearing lots of debates about it, even in the presidential election. And then last, leadership. I would argue that there's been tremendous organizational penetration and leadership in the public and private sectors among African Americans, but also other racial and ethnic groups. So I'm basically saying this is a kind of optimistic future. I'm arguing that there's challenges. There's no question that the Trump administration has worked very hard to undercut all of the reforms that were being put in place over the last 40 to 50 years. But that there's enough structural changes that make I'm stepping out here, okay, that make this long-term probably stable or survivable. So one example of this, for example, with the way in which the Congress is functioning, what Nancy Pelosi has in her back pocket includes, for example, these alliances, the Congressional Tri-Caucus, coalitions and substantive representation, in which the Congressional Black Caucus, founded in 1971, now has, for members of the House, 51 members of the House, 2 non-voting delegates, and 2 U.S. senators. It's the historic high of all of the years in which there have been blacks elected to to Congress. And of course, I'm pausing over the Elijah Cummings passage, passing away just last night, early this morning. We'll see who his successor is. One would expect it to be an African American, but we'll see. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus was founded in '76 and includes 38 members. The Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus was founded in 1994. The way in which they describe each other is somewhat different. So for the Asian Pacific American Caucus, it has what they call members, and they have executive board members, 21 executive board members, 4 executive board in the House, 4 in the Senate, 50 associate members. I couldn't quite figure out who were the actual Asian Pacific American members. Some of the allies of the executive board members, I guess, would include someone like a Kamala Harris, who is, of course, Asian American as well as African American, but others, as well as some members of the Congressional Black Caucus who are members of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. But we're talking about more than 100 people, well over 100 in this tri-caucus, who are therefore in a Senate or a House of 450 members. They form a very substantial portion of the voting population. And given the extent to which they're mostly Democrats, they are a powerful resource for their political leader, particularly a Democratic political leader. To me, that's one of the factors that doesn't keep problematic legislation from passing. It doesn't solve the problem of how do you get a new member of the court elected who's not a Trump ally. It doesn't keep that person from being passed. It happens in the Senate, not the House. But it does say something about what the legislative power can be in the House. Now, this is a slightly different topic, but it's still something I'm going to talk about. This was a course I taught at Illinois for many years, and I began to teach it, inheriting it from the late Michael Preston, which was his title of the course, a very kind of long and funny title, Black Political Participation in the American Political Process. But I began it with this introduction to the course on my syllabus. Racial issues provoke crises in American politics. Changes in racial status prompt American political institutions to operate in distinctive ways. In order for blacks to begin to exercise ordinary citizenship rights, such as voting, for example, they were required to take extreme measures and to act outside of normal political channels. Excluded from political participation for most of the first 2 centuries of the American nation, African Americans display atypical political profiles when compared to other Americans. Black organizations and political leaders are often distinct from their white peers. So here we have an example of an absent-minded professor. In the excitement in the lead up to the Obama 2008 election and 2012 re-election, I'd forgotten these earlier descriptions of the U.S. political system and how it operated, that it was not a simple process, that it was not always welcomed, that any kind of racial change provoked crises in American politics, and that we should not expect it to be any different in the case of the Obama elections. I'd forgotten my own previous framing. In other words, if the first patterns were accurate, that racial change provokes crises, then even though the later developments involved significant change, the increase in black electoral participation and representation, even at the presidential level, could not be sustained without American political institutions shifting back towards the American mean, towards exclusion. So then you have the question of whether the Trump victory can be sustained. As I've said and implied already, the Trump victory has been very hard for me to process. For several years, I've looked at the at the research, this research, my own work in this, the increasing representation, the strategic efforts, good and bad, of African Americans to bring that change into and sustain it, make it real. Black politics after the Civil Rights Movement had come to this, to the election of Obama first and then Trump. What? The decades of work seemed to be moving in the right direction, at least, and then the improbable election of Obama surprised, astonished many of the most astute observers into saying, not in my lifetime. Lucius Barker, Toni Morrison, there were many people who said that, and I quoted that in my presidential address at the APSA, and I was one of those people going, not in my lifetime. And then Trump, the opposite and the inverse of an Obama. And yesterday was the 1,000th day of Trump's presidency. He may have lost his base with his moves in terms of Syria and his problems in handling his interactions with Erdogan. So I have just one or two more slides, and I'm going to say this. I haven't tried to make this a very detailed discussion, but there are some non-racial political factors, although there really aren't. There really are, include race, shaping electoral outcomes. Okay, down the rabbit hole, the whole issue about social media. Did the Russians reshape the election? We've seen people like, as esteemed as Kathleen Hall Jamieson, argue that Russian hackers and trolls helped elect a president. Malcolm Nance, who's interesting but not an academic, but still an important person who has some knowledge of this. Earlier this week, the Senate Committee on Intelligence talked about Russian active measures, campaigns, and interference in the 2016 election, and they had issued already a volume 1, this is volume 2, on use of social media with additional views in terms of Russia. And one of their concluding comments, addressing the challenge of disinformation in the long term will ultimately need to be tackled by an informed and discerning population of citizens who are both alert to the threat and armed with the critical thinking skills necessary to protect against malicious influence. A public initiative propelled by federal funding, but led in part by state and local education institutions focused on building media literacy from an early age, would help build long-term resilience to foreign manipulation of our democracy. And the crisis that's going on right now in terms of Syria and Trump and Ukraine is about these issues of foreign manipulation and willingness of Russia to participate in. Such an effort at protecting our democracy could benefit from the resources and knowledge of private sector technology companies. So that's the Senate's comments on it. And then, so racial dynamics in the American context, the second century civil rights and protests. I'm saying that the institutional reforms that we've observed over the last 50 years have substantially recreated the American electoral and political process. No, it's not repression comparable to the 19th century, nadir. And I'd argue that that will make it possible for survival of the overall effects of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The source of most tension will probably be the federal courts, meaning the Supreme Court and the district courts that the Federalist Project has been able to enact over the last 20 or 30 years, of making sure that the federal district court judges, as well as Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, are appropriate judges in their definition. Racial dynamics in the American context, yes, there will certainly be a dynamic tension related to race. It's too central to American life for it to disappear. And then there's this last point. The innovations growing out of social media have given organizations and nations new weapons. How the U.S. responds to Russia's use of them to exacerbate American racial instabilities will help to answer the question of how long this period will last and what this period will be, actually. So one of the quotes I want to make to you from a talk that I was able to hear last weekend, as a number of people were inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. One of the people inducted was Sherilyn Eiffel, who was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She said, among many other things, time to rebuild again. And it's that notion of the fact that you have to reconceptualize and rebuild the structures of democratic participation and protection in the courts. Ironically, she represents one of the organizations that laid the foundation for 20th century reform and makes clear what we need to do now, what we need to do next. So I've presented or proposed a kind of broad understanding of how this period of change has occurred and what is possible in the near future. So I look forward to your questions. Yes, okay. Sorry. Walter.
So I'm struck, I think it's this slide, you talk about the courts, and my thought was, it's a mistake to rely on the courts to solve our problems, and I wonder whether it's a mistake as well to see the courts as fundamentally blocking solutions. Certainly the courts are tearing up institutions that are protected, but it seems to me that the kind of things that really make a difference, mobilization, legislation, collective action, all those things, are more important than the courts. And I don't know exactly how the current obstacles will be overcome, but I think they won't be major ones. I wonder whether you agree with that kind of assessment or you think the courts are more important than that.
Well, I think given the separation of powers and the ways in which each branch has some authority, and particularly the president able to use executive authority, having a check in some way through the courts is not to be ignored. And I find it's kind of, it's an interesting argument you're making, because it's not an argument I've heard frequently, that the courts are not so important, particularly when it comes to civil and voting rights issues. The courts have, I would argue, been very important. I am saying, of course, that the legislation, the structural changes, the election of people to office, the presence of those congressional caucuses, the size of that representation is such that, while there was this rather dramatic drop in electoral participation in the late 19th, early 20th century, I don't have the imagination to imagine that all of that can go away quickly, even with the ending of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act being able to be used. So I feel like I think it's I have an ambivalent response to your question. I don't agree with you, but I'm also saying I've also made an argument in which the courts can be seen as not insignificant, but there are other resources that exist and can be brought to bear. My point is more the extent to which the Federalist Project has been very successful at putting people at relatively young ages into federal district courts, and they'll be in office for, in place for a long time to come. The same with Kavanaugh, the same with Gorsuch. So, which is why, we're all, people are sort of hoping that Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be able to last a little longer. So I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know how to answer your question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I think the question about the courts made me think, you talked about courts, you talked about the elected officials, CBC, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So what role do things like the Black Lives Matter and other social movements play in helping us survive this next period?
Well, I think it's part of the issue of the dynamics of racial politics, of when there's some set of issues on the table, people's lives, and the ability to represent and to present the ways in which they're treated in such a clear way, you know, the use of this little thing that we can all take pictures of everything all the time, so that it's represented in a way that the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s began to be able to convey its changes, because people could see on local news what was happening in Selma, and see what was happening at various places that previously would not have been covered by TV news cameras and so forth. So the Black Lives Matter pushes forward a new set of issues that organizations like the Legal Defense Fund and various legal organizations, which themselves then innovate and become different than was the case 30 or 40 years before. They have to both create new projects, but new organizations begin to represent the interests of people who are subject to those changes. So you get a set of private lawyers. I don't remember his first name, but Mr. Crump, who's been active since about 2012, when the young man in Florida was killed. He's been getting more and more business, unfortunately, because there's plenty of business to get. Yeah, which, you know, the fact that you can create a network of private attorneys who can do that work that previously collective organizations were engaged in, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because there weren't enough black attorneys in the South in the 40s and 50s to represent the interests, or to brave those cities and those towns. Now you have the very fact that you have private attorneys who can do that work and survive it tells you something about how things have changed. So that's my answer. It's not a full. Zoe?
Thanks, Professor Pender-Hughes. I'm wondering, and thinking about like descriptive representation and like the increase of black politicians, how you see, I don't know what the right phrasing is, like the liberalization of like black youth in comparison to
the what of black youth?
This is not the right phrasing, but
liberalization, was that what you said?
Yeah. So like, for example, more like young black people are supportive of candidates for the Democratic primary for 2019, 2020, like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, than they are somebody like Cory Booker or Kamala Harris, who sort of represent like the establishment, old school view of black politics. So how do you see those dynamics changing?
Okay, so yeah, they represent old school black, but so Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who are not so young themselves.
Yeah, but their policies are like, I don't know. Yeah, their policies are a lot more liberal.
So that, yeah, okay. Yeah, there's that question.
And they receive a lot of support amongst like black people who are a bit younger. So I don't know, how do you see that in like the context of the history of black politicians?
Well, I guess you could argue that Harris and Booker are kind of out there on the edges in some way. So Kamala Harris is from California. Yes, she went to Howard University, but she is her mother was an Indian, South Asian Indian. Her father was Jamaican, but she grew up in California and Toronto. And Cory Booker. There are lots of people who are always very skeptical of Cory Booker. They think he's too conservative. They don't trust him, this, that, and the other. So there's so partly I'm pointing to the race test, how black are they issue, and then there's the, you raised a different issue, namely how liberal are they? They're not liberal enough for the young population. So I wonder how, what does this mean in terms of people's definition of what's liberal? How would we judge that? And okay, here we are, public opinion center of the world. So somebody can comment on this as to what surveys of young black voters has shown. Maybe somebody can offer a comment here. I can't, but you don't know. Okay, so I don't feel bad if I say I don't know. He doesn't know. But that's a really good racial research question, I would say, for somebody here to undertake. The extent to which young people look at black candidates, and I guess all black people would say, myself, I would prefer to have a black candidate, but then there's so my question is, I live in South Bend, Mayor Pete is my mayor, there's a lot of criticism of Pete Buttigieg, people say he's not reflective of, interested in the black community. People have been very critical of him there. Paul pointed out to me, sorry, your brother, Ken pointed out to me that there was an article in the South Bend Tribune about how he seems to be more attracted to, or people are more attracted to him from the upper middle class in the African American community in South Bend than the working class and poorer communities there. And certainly he has been substantially criticized. I saw him at an event recently that was created to cross racial, ethnic, and religious lines, something called Faith in Indiana, which groups of religious and other organizations are trying to work on how to deal with killings, including police killings, but youth killing each other in the community, trying to deal with immigration questions. It's quite an interesting policy group. They bring public officials to a big room and then read them questions. Will you support this? And Mr. Mayor, yes or no? Then you're supposed to answer the question. Will the police chief, will the county official do this? And they've obviously talked with them beforehand, so it's not a surprise question. They know the answer is supposed to be yes. And watching Mayor Pete in that setting was interesting because he'd obviously been interacting with this network of organizations, but also ministers. This one was taking place at a Church of God in Christ, and the person reading the questions was a black minister. He seemed, Buttigieg is he's not a charismatic figure. He didn't go to black churches when he was growing up. His parents were academics. I don't even know if his parents were Catholic, but they were there at Notre Dame teaching and so forth. So he doesn't have the Jesse Jackson. He doesn't pass the Jesse Jackson test of being able to reach out in a charismatic way to attract black individuals or young people. But he's working hard to try to learn that. There's no question about that. At least from my observation. So I think that the attraction to, so the people who are saying this, a question I would have is, are they themselves, they see themselves as very liberal, they see themselves as progressive, they see themselves as left, or is it just in that context of all of those candidates that they're more attractive than the two black candidates? Just a question, which we'll obviously continue to talk about. Yes.
I was hoping you could talk about new suffrage movements, especially with, I know recently in the 2018 election, Florida voted to give suffrage back to felons who had not committed violent acts, or there's a bunch of stipulations, but because it it like prompted this reaction from people where Governor DeSantis said no, like maybe we shouldn't pass this amendment so quickly. And I was hoping maybe you could talk about how that might affect what you expect with like contested progress.
Well, and I don't know what's actually happened, but my understanding was the Florida legislature was working very hard to require people to pay money in order to be able to register. In other words, to remove that, even though it was passed by referendum in the state 2018 legislation, they've basically taken it off the table by requiring people to pay a certain amount of money. So your question was, how does that affect these changes? So yeah, I mean that was a really exciting prospect in the 2018 election, that the black candidate was part of that process of pushing forward that referendum, and it passed. It was successful. But then it's like, oh no, we can't permit that. So I don't know how to. It certainly does in a state like Florida, and I guess I would think that the activists who engage in that would be thinking about, okay, where else are we going to do this, and how are we going to have a step ahead of time in order to protect them, to prevent those legislators from ripping away what we just got the legislature, the electorate, to agree to support. I would imagine that some of those types of organizations would be working hard to think about how to redo it. Because it certainly was the case that the prospect of many more black voters on the rolls in Florida would take Florida away from the Republican Party. And whether, what's being done to counter that, or whether that action is, whether they're implementing other kinds of voting law changes of the kind I was summarizing before that would make it impossible to sustain that reform. So it's a question, it's not an answer. But it's a good question to ask. Thank you. This one right.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was wondering about the slide where you put up the inspiring progress made in terms of representation in the House of both Black and Hispanic and Asian Pacific Americans. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like the success is predominantly in the House and less so the Senate. And I wondered, given the balance of power in Congress and the control over certain reins that the Senate has, 2 out of 100 being African American, this is yet a long way to go in terms of representation, at least demographic representation. And if you could speak to the institutional structures that prevent the Senate from getting more representation.
That was designed that way, statewide election, and therefore any kind of minority populations, literal minorities and numerical minorities within a state, unless you have a candidate like a Barack Obama or a Kamala Harris, and California is different than the other states, it's going to be hard to get a lot of diversity in the Senate. That's just structurally organized to do that. I suppose you do have some other cases in some parts of the Southwest and the West and the Southwest where Hispanics and Asian Pacific Americans are more likely to be able to run successfully even if they're not a majority of the population. It's not that you have to have a huge population, but you've got to have large enough so that you can combine with some other coalition group in order to win. Texas is another possibility, I would think, for the to take on the Senate. But you're pointing to a structural aspect of the American political system that's just there, and that I suppose the success of Obama in winning the presidency is an example of showing that you can do it, but you've got to work very hard and very carefully, and with a great deal of invention for it to be successful. So there probably are some states that could be targeted, and perhaps some of the presidential candidates who are running could think about that as part of their campaigns? Thank you for the question. Is there somebody back there?
Several hands up. Where would you like to go?
I think there are people in a couple of places.
I'm sorry, who did you call on?
I think there's a person right there in the back. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these remarks. I really appreciate them. I just was wondering if I could ask you to elaborate on the interesting closing where you gave us a quote from the Senate committee investigating the influence of Russia and social media. And the reason I ask about that is that I'm just, I guess I worry sometimes about calls for media literacy. It's difficult to be against literacy as an educator. It's difficult to be against critical thinking. But at the same time, I mean, these platforms are implicated in, for example, the rise of white supremacy. You know, that Facebook is, you know, under investigation for violating the civil rights laws, the Fair Housing Act. It's just difficult to think, well, the solution is going to be we have to build this apparatus of what Howard, you know, called lying machines, and then we'll just teach our children to resist them. It seems like when I see the statement out of the committee, I just think, well, maybe that's just laissez-faire. It's like, well, we don't have a political will to regulate, so we're just going to call for more literacy. But at the same time, I don't want to be against literacy, so I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Probably not. It's just a kind of, it was something I read. It just got released this week. It was, you know, I use this phrase when the last two slides I used that phrase because it is kind of down a rabbit hole. It's like the idea of doing the investigations and trying to make sense out of what did Russia do, and it just sounds pretty crazy, you know. And you think, how do I make any sense out of this? I'd rather not think about it. And so, seeing that the Senate committee it's a bipartisan committee. It's not just a partisan committee. It's a bipartisan committee. That they were willing to say this is a problem. Russia was engaged in an effort, and it clearly needs to be addressed in light of the 2020 election and in the future, and also that it was an effort that allowed for the stimulation of feelings of abuse by African Americans. Don't trust Hillary Clinton. Evidently, the Facebook posts were most effective in terms of African Americans. And how do you begin to address that? It's something I wanted to put in. I don't have more than those 1.5 slides to say it, but it's just like, well, it's worth beginning to take seriously. That's part of what I was trying to do in including them. How you do that and how you begin to address it without feeling like you're part of the crazy people because you're talking about it is what I'm not sure about. It's not an easy subject to deal with, and it's a very sense of not deja vu. It's very dizzying, disorienting kind of thing to think about. That's my reaction to it when I think about talking about it. I haven't read these books, but I know. I mean, Jameson is obviously a very serious scholar, and I've heard in like what Malcolm Nance has to say. But it's been a very challenging period, and you just think, well, okay, all of the talk about Clinton, and there's still talking about Clinton in terms of Ukraine, and is the server in Ukraine? Where is it? You know, it sounds like insanity. So that's why it's like I know it's there, but I don't have any more detailed comments. But I'm going to have to start trying to tread into that period and figure out how to teach it as a subject of some seriousness. Those are my comments. Yeah, there's a couple of blue and gray.
Hi there, and thank you. I'm wondering, especially when it comes to representation in the House, how there has been a lot of study, a lot more study put into notions of gerrymandering, and the effect of gerrymandering on racial representation and racial politics. On the one hand, you have a lot of areas where you can crack up old neighborhoods and have by having these 60-40 splits or 45-55 splits, you can make large parts of the demographics of those states irrelevant for the sake of voting. But you also have issues of packing districts in which you can have very strong representation for certain kind of candidates, but only in one district. And I'm wondering how both of those affect racial or ideological representation of members of the House. It's no Republican would ever bother running against John Lewis, for example, but outside of there you might have districts that are 40% African American in Georgia, but their political opinions will just never be heard from their representatives.
And that's why I remembered hearing some of my colleagues some years ago kind of chuckling about the idea that African Americans would want to have a predominantly black district. But the point you just made about 40% black district, but yet their interests are not going to be represented. That's why a lot of the voting rights lawyers and organizations in the 80s and the 90s were pushing for creating majority-minority districts, because they knew that if they had a large enough proportion of the population that was African American and likely to be able to elect the vote, quote unquote, elect the voter of your choice, if it's black, predominantly black, if it's Latino, predominantly Latino. Asian Americans are a little bit different because of the small number of locations in the country in which they're a large portion of the population. But it's only with that majority-minority district that you're likely to get black representation, and not likely in the case of other proportions. Now, we've seen some changes in people's willingness to vote for blacks or minorities, and I think that that's probably going to continue to improve. The issue of quote unquote gerrymandering, even the term itself I was a little troubled by it, because people usually, when they use that term, they usually are pointing to districts that have been drawn to represent and elect minority populations. North Carolina is the heart of it. You know, the tension that's been going on since the 1990s of that, and there have been cases back and forth between the way in which the districts are drawn, what the Supreme Court what the Supreme Court decides on it, and each time you turn around, there's another set of back and forth in terms of you got to redraw these districts. So I think the assumption is that we should be able to draw districts simply, and it should be fair, and that, if you vote fairly, then they shouldn't need to draw districts that are unusually shaped. But in fact, that's what began to be done particularly in the 1990s, when litigators are able to use, and their alliances or allies are able to use software to help draw the districts and to select minute areas in which you could add to a district to make sure that it's a relatively large minority population. It can work both ways, unfortunately. You can draw the district in ways that keep whites in the district in certain ways as well. And I would say that the state of Georgia is an example. You mentioned John Lewis, but Georgia's a very relatively high proportion of blacks in the state, but they're at this point not particularly large black representation any longer. So it's a tension that has been a part of the choices about the outcomes of voting for the last 20 to 30 years. Now, the size of the Interracial Black Caucus means that there's some additional, I need to go back, that there's a good number of blacks in those, in the Congress from districts, some of which are majority black and some of which are not. You know, we have, what's her name, Lauren Underwood from Illinois, who's elected from a very largely white district outside of Chicago. I know that there are a number of others, which I've not tried to do for this talk, to see how many are from non-majority black districts. I didn't do that. So it would be interesting to look at that and see what those numbers look like. That's what I'll say. And we had one more question right here.
So I was thinking about more broadly this idea of civil rights and protest, and thinking about now in 2016, what does it mean to have a civil rights movement and a larger protest movement with no face? With no face. To the extent that you can think of the civil rights movement back in the 1900s, you can attach King to it, you can attach all of these political or somewhat political figures to it, and we don't necessarily have that now. So what do you think that means for the solutions that we're trying to put forward, objectives that we're trying to reach, organization? It almost seems as though, even thinking about social media, it seems as though the victims of a lot of these protests are the face of the movement, and it's not really necessarily the leadership. So I just wanted to know what you thought about the whole idea of progress without leadership and organization, or if it is and we can't put a face to it.
That's a great question. I love the way you framed it, and I would say, you said it, the face of the movement is the people who've been subject to the discrimination. You hope that some of them are not, have to be killed in order to be the face of it, but that's what seems to be, unfortunately, happen all too often. But I think that I would say, part of what I would say is that the strength of the organizations that exist, both the old-fashioned civil rights organizations, the newly fashioned ones, we were talking about Black Lives Matter with Ken before, and the innovation associated with lots of new movements when some terrible crime occurs by the police, by some local person who decides, that he's going to protect his local community, as was the case with Trayvon Martin. I think, in a sense, what we're seeing is the full mobilization of the African American community, that people are not afraid to rise up and to take make public stands about it, and to protest in the streets, and to do things that you wouldn't necessarily think you'd be safe doing all the time. And, in the case of Ferguson, for example, that some of the people, not just Ferguson, but in a number of places, people who participated in the protests, who were the parents of the person killed, they then run for office and get elected. It happened in Ferguson. It happened in Georgia. The woman whose son was killed, she's now in Congress. So I think it's almost as if the capacity for civil society and political mobilization is I won't say it's easy to do, but people are doing it a lot, frequently. And social media makes it easier to do as well. Okay, one quote I'll give and then we'll be done. Ella Baker used to say, "Strong people don't need strong leaders." And it seems to me that's where we're seeing community organizing, local organizing, community organizing, grassroots organizing happening frequently. And those local leaders rise up and they, they take the mic and they're there and they're challenging the police, they're challenging the local officials, and they're successful at it. So I don't think you need to have it's a great phrase, civil rights movement without a face. I think you're right, and it's okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Diane, that was great. That was a great set of questions. There's a reception afterwards. Please go outside, and we can continue the conversation more individually outside. So thank you again, and thanks, Vince, and thanks everybody for coming. All right.